Hello everyone, my name is Milagros Micheli and I'm here with my colleague Martin Schüssler, and in this video we will be presenting our investigation into data annotation. So work practices surrounding the production of data are fundamental for machine learning because every machine learning system is trained on the base of data that has been collected, selected, cleaned, and also annotated by humans. Now, our study focuses on data annotation for vision models. That means that today we will be discussing image data, pictures. And it's about the production of data sets that will later be used to train and evaluate products such as autonomous driving or facial recognition systems, for example. Now, the work practices surrounding data annotation that we have observed can mainly be organized or described around two types of tasks. The first task is called semantic segmentation and the second one is labeling. But what we found is that the work of data annotators is mostly about sense making. It's about making sense of data. And in the cases that we will describe here, it's about interpreting the content of images. And the important thing to mention about that sense-making praxis is that it never happens in a vacuum. It is conversely very much informed by the context in which it takes place. So that context will have a decisive effect on the interpretations that will be carried out by annotators and consequently will also shape the data sets that will be produced. So we conducted a constructivist grounded theory investigation of data annotation in industrial settings. That means that the context we have been looking into is our industries. And that investigation included several weeks of fieldwork in Argentina and Bulgaria at two annotation companies where we conducted observations and also interviews. And afterwards, we went on interviewing experts and computer vision practitioners working in different places of the world, such as Germany, India, Kenya, and Iraq. Our concrete research questions were: how do data annotators make sense of image data? What conditions, structures, and standards shape that sense-making praxis? And who and at what stages of the annotation process decides which classifications best define an image? Now, we found that annotations are not solely and not even mainly performed by annotators. So they are actually done in many iterations that involve many actors. And the goal of every annotation project is to achieve a certain level of standardization in regard to the labels, of course, but also in regard to workflows. And most importantly, we found that there is an attempt to standardize the interpretations and the subjectivities of individual workers so they may perform annotations in a similar manner. And that type of standardization is assured throughout several layers and throughout several iterations. And we found that those iterations are not horizontal and they are not at all democratic. And this is why we depict them here on the slide as hierarchical layers. The higher the position occupied by an actor, the more power that actor will have to impose meaning on data or to decide which classifications best define a given data point. And on top of that hierarchy is, of course, the client. The client is the one who has the final say in this matter, because in the end, the client is the one paying for those annotations to be carried out in the first place. Now, these power structures are generally accepted and even naturalized by annotators and also by all other actors involved in these dynamics. So in the end, the boss decides because the boss is the boss and the client is king, so the client has the right to say how annotations are to be conducted. So one fundamental finding of our investigation is that clients have the faculty to impose their preferred classifications just as they have the financial means to pay for labelers or for annotators to execute that imposition. And the question of imposition is actually a very decisive one. So previous research in the field of data annotation has largely focused on individual subjectivities of workers to account for biased labels. And we say, yeah, worker subjectivities are, of course, a factor to take into account in this space. But actually, there is a lot more to it, because the interpretations that are performed by annotators are persistently subject to structural constraints and, as we have seen, top-down impositions that are carried out throughout the layers that we have described before. So a very important observation of ours is showing that the power asymmetries that we describe not only affect labor conditions or reflect the asymmetrical relationship between commissioning clients and service providers, because these observations are actually something that could be pretty obvious for anyone living in capitalism. But the main point, the main contribution of our research is to show that those power imbalances concretely shape data and concretely shape data sets, and they will have a decisive effect on systems that are created on the base of that data.
So from these findings, we distilled several implications for practitioners, namely that they need to document, reflect, and communicate the subjective choices that went into data annotations. And we see this as a responsibility of both the clients that are commissioning the annotation of data sets, as well as the management of the annotation companies. And the main solution here is documentation. So the purpose, the composition, and the intention of datasets should be documented. And this is actually a best practice that's being currently adopted in machine learning research. If you checked NIPS and ICML recently, you would have noticed that authors are now required to include a complete description of the data collection process, as well as the instructions given to annotators, the method of quality control, if the major contribution of a paper is a dataset. And so translated into more practical terms, we suggest that companies really keep track of the instructions that they were giving to annotators. But we also suggest that documentation should be extended with a power-aware perspective to make explicit the structures, decisions, and actors, as well as the frameworks that have shaped the annotation of data. And how you would incorporate such a power-aware perspective will now illustrate with a couple of potential questions you might ask. So you could, for example, ask, whose product do the annotations serve and how? Whose rationales behind the taxonomies that were applied to data? Who resolved discrepancies in the annotation process? And who decided if labels were correctly allocated? Then, of course, checklists are not prescriptive, and they shouldn't be. They actually need to be further developed and exchanged between researchers and practitioners so that they actually apply to more context, because right now those checklists probably don't apply to every machine learning context where a product is developed. At the same time, documentation is also quite costly for companies, and even more so, it may put trade secrets of the annotation companies or the clients at risk. At the same time, there are major benefits that you get when you do proper documentation. Firstly, you have improved deliberate accountability and interorganizational traceability. So by tracing down who did what and when, you help to address this problem of diluting accountability if you have so many actors and layers. So documentation can really help you in this regard. A second major benefit is that documentation can help you with the compliance to regulations, to name an example with the GDPR, and in particular the contained so-called right to explanation, because if you have proper documentation, you'll actually keep track of all the data that went into an automated decision, and especially how that data came to be. If regulation is not an option, you could think of transparency certifications or quality seals for datasets. But at the same time, you may want to turn this around and think regulation can really provide an incentive for companies to do better documentation. And the last asset that might be created for companies is the explication and preservation of knowledge. So documentation can help you to keep track of how data annotation is actually done in practice in your company. And this is then made persistent and reproducible, so you actually don't lose that knowledge once workers change companies, which does happen quite commonly in the field of machine learning. We've also distilled some implications for researchers, namely that we need to investigate context more. So in particular in machine learning, we need to shed light on all the labor that goes into machine learning products, And at the same time, we also need to show the power dynamics of imposition negotiation, because those definitely shape the work practices. And through the work practices, it does shape data-driven products. This also connects to the stepping implication, namely that we should shift the gaze up, meaning that we should not just focus on like individual workers or like the shop floor level of data annotation, because there's been some work prior that rather focused on like individual subjectivities of workers and how that may influence data. But instead, we should rather look at the structures and the market logics that actually shape this data work, and through that again the products. The next implication is that we need to develop situated solutions. I've mentioned this before. So researchers and practitioners actually need to jointly work towards plausible solutions and practice, because us researchers alone will never be aware of all the little details that apply in a particular context of one machine learning product. So there needs to be a proper exchange. And lastly, using grounded theory in such a context has taught us that it's also important for us as researchers to reflect our own position. So we should always acknowledge that the findings that we've presented are actually co-constructed between us, the researchers, and the participants. So the take-home message from this small talk here is: annotation practices are never objective, self-evident, or neutral. Instead, there are power asymmetries, and those power asymmetries, they do shape data. So right now we're quite worried about black box machine learning models, but we should also be worried about black box datasets, because if a dataset is not properly documented, it's a black box. Hence, we need more and better documentation. Regulations can actually help steer companies to put transparency as well as societal and ethical considerations over the rationale of profit maximization. And lastly, for us researchers, there's the need to shift the gaze up and study more of the structures, as well as to trying to develop more practical recommendations jointly with practitioners. We hope you found this short presentation of our work interesting. For more details, please refer to the full paper.